The birthday dinner. That's where we should begin. I think not with a backstory, not with the years of assembling myself into someone useful, but with the exact moment the silence in a room became the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My name is Vera, and on the evening of my 34th birthday, I sat at a table in a restaurant called the Meridian. The chandeliers were doing what chandeliers do. The jazz trio in the corner was doing what jazz trios do. And Daniel, my husband of 6 years, a state attorney, a man who had built a career out of knowing exactly which words to say and when, stood at Celeste's side wearing an expression I recognized. I had mistaken it for tenderness once. Now I could read it for what it was, the careful blankness of someone managing optics. Nobody moved. The table held about 14 people, friends, a few colleagues, my mother Renata at the far end, and every one of them looked at me with that particular hunger people reserve for disasters they didn't cause. I could feel them waiting for me to fold. To weep or throw a glass or do something appropriately cinematic. I did not do those things. I lifted my wine. I took a slow sip. And I let the silence run long enough that several people began to look uncomfortable for the wrong reasons. Here is what they did not know. I had spent the previous 3 weeks preparing for this exact moment. Let me go back a little. I grew up in a cramped row house in Providence, 2 daughters, 2 parents who ran a bookkeeping practice from the kitchen table. Celeste was 2 years younger than me and possessed of a particular talent for being seen. She took up space in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. I was the one who checked the gas bill and reminded our parents about parent-teacher conferences and learned early that competence was its own kind of invisibility. I became a healthcare compliance auditor. The work suits me. I follow paper trails. I find where numbers don't agree with each other. I sit with documents until they confess. Daniel used to joke that I could find fraud in a grocery receipt. I always thought he was being affectionate. We had been trying to have a child for 2 years. Every specialist visit, every test, every small defeat, Daniel held my hand through all of it and told me we would figure it out. When I asked whether he should also be tested, he went once to a clinic in the city, came home subdued, and told me the results were fine. The problem was mine, he said. The doctor had been clear. I believed him for 14 months. What changed? I was searching our home network for a file I needed for a work audit, and I found an email thread on a shared family tablet that had been left open. The subject line was 2 words, our arrangement. I read it in approximately 4 minutes. By the end of those 4 minutes I understood that Celeste had not accidentally fallen into something. She and Daniel had been conducting this for over a year. The last message sent from Celeste's account noted with some satisfaction that announcing the pregnancy at my birthday dinner would accelerate the timeline. She used the phrase Vera will step aside. She wrote it as though it were already settled. I put the tablet down on the kitchen counter. I walked to the bathroom. I ran cold water over my wrists, the way I do when I'm processing something large, and I stood there until my breathing was regular. Then I called my friend Sable, who has been my closest friend since our first year at university, and I told her what I had read. Her first question was, "Do you want to cry, or do you want to work?" I said, "Both, but work first." Sable is not a lawyer, but she has the instincts of one, patient, systematic, very good at knowing which door to knock on. She spent 11 days helping me locate the medical records I needed. Daniel had told me his clinic visit showed no issues on his side. What the records actually showed, obtained through a process I will only describe as methodical, was that Daniel had a condition rendering him essentially sterile. The visit he'd described had confirmed it. He had known for over a year. He had let me attend appointment after appointment, let me absorb the grief of believing my body was failing us, let me apologize to him, and he had said nothing. I sat with that for a long time. Not the betrayal of the affair, that was its own clean wound, but the particular cruelty of this. He had handed me a self-conception as broken and watched me carry it. After that, the rest was auditor's work. I pulled our joint financial records. I found transfers I couldn't account for, a pattern of cash withdrawals across 8 months, totaling close to $180,000. I cross-referenced them with Daniel's firm's escrow accounts. There were discrepancies. I hired a man named Aldous, a private investigator who ran a modest office near the waterfront and who listened to my summary without interrupting, then said, "Give me 10 days." What he found was worse than I had imagined. Daniel had been routing client funds, estate settlements, trust disbursements, through a structure that obscured his withdrawals. Some of that money had ended up in a property purchase. The deed listed my mother's name. My mother, who had watched this dinner get planned, who had responded to my text about the reservation with a string of heart emojis. I did not cry. I made a folder. The night before the dinner, I stood on my apartment balcony and looked at the city and held 2 documents in my hand. One was Daniel's medical record. The other was Aldous's findings, annotated and organized in the way I organize everything, by date, by amount, by institution. I had already spoken with a law firm. I had already given them copies. The birthday dinner was not a trap I was walking into. It was the last move in a sequence I had been setting up for 3 weeks. Celeste stood up at the Meridian and made her announcement, and I waited until the room had fully absorbed it, and then I stood as well. I said I wanted to offer a toast. I said to clarity. And then I reached into my bag, and I placed Daniel's medical record on the table in front of him, and I said, his face did something I won't describe in detail. Celeste's expression shifted from triumph to something more confused. Because the record said what it said. And what it said meant her pregnancy had nothing to do with Daniel, which meant the entire architecture of the evening was collapsing in real time. I looked at my mother. I said, "The property in Barton Hills is going to come up in the investigation, Mom. I'd suggest you speak to someone before Thursday." The room was very still. Daniel started to say something about privacy, about my interpretation, about context, and I sat back down and finished my wine. Sable appeared at my elbow with my coat. We walked out through the main entrance, and as we reached the door, Celeste caught my arm and said my name twice with increasing desperation, and I looked at her for a moment and said, "You should call whoever the actual father is. He should probably know." The door closed. I stood on the pavement and breathed the night air, and felt for the first time in months, like the ground beneath me was my own. The 6 months that followed were paperwork. Daniel's firm opened an internal investigation. The law firm I'd retained filed on my behalf. The settlement, reached to avoid public proceedings, was adequate. I found a small apartment in a neighborhood I'd always liked, 3rd floor, east-facing windows, a view of the canal. I took a ceramics class on Saturday mornings. I was very bad at it, which I found I didn't mind. Sable came one afternoon and we laughed until the instructor asked us to keep it down. I received a news notification, some weeks later, informing me that Daniel had entered a plea agreement related to the financial charges. I read the headline and set my phone face down on the workbench and returned to the bowl I was trying to center. On my balcony, I keep a plant that was nearly dead when I bought it, a small orchid I found on a discount shelf. 2 leaves, no blooms, the soil dry and cracked. I watered it. I gave it the right light. Last week it put out a new shoot. I am not the kind of person who draws large conclusions from small things. But I noticed the shoot. I notice it every morning. What happened to me was a form of theft. Not just of money or of a marriage, but of my own account of myself. For over a year, I believed a story someone else had written for me, that I was incomplete, that I had failed at something fundamental. When I found out none of it was true, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt the specific, disorienting grief of realizing how much energy I had given to something that was never real. I am rebuilding more carefully now. I am less interested in being useful to people who have no intention of being useful back. Have you ever considered how much of the story you're living was actually written by someone else, and what it might take to simply sit down, open the document, and start making your own edits?